Navy and the slave trade. And he said, what's it about? The Royal Navy using slaves? And I said, no, it's about the Royal Navy fighting the slave trade and rescuing people from slavery. And he said, if we had a book like that, it'd be out there in the middle of the window. Historians have generally tended to ignore this subject. Naval historians tend to concentrate on big battles and big issues like command of the sea. But in fact, the Royal Navy fought the slave trade for 50 years, and the history of that campaign includes ship-to-ship battles, good old-fashioned boarding party fights with cutlasses and pistols on the decks of the slavers, assaults in small boats against slave ships anchored in the African rivers with the slave ships firing broadsides as the men in the small boats closed to board, expeditions up the African rivers to free large numbers of slaves from the big holding pens called barracoons, episodes in which prize crews had to fight off pirates who had them outmanned and outgunned and were trying to get control of the human cargo that the prize crews were trying to take to safety. Sinkings followed by the usual stories of long periods at sea on improvised rafts. Expeditions up the African rivers to get the African kings to sign treaties in which they would agree to stop selling people to the European traders, and expeditions up the African rivers to enforce the treaties when the kings decided that that was a better business than exporting palm oil. And the campaign also included some of the less dramatic aspects of warfare, including boredom, hard work, and disease. Many of the officers who served in the African squadron wrote of the monotony of patrolling this coast, which seen from the sea consists of just miles and miles and miles of low-lying vegetation. The British were, in effect, blockading a large section, or attempting to blockade a large section of the African coast, and blockade duty largely consists of cruising up and down and hoping something would happen. This is also an area in which they had to deal with very light winds that were very unpredictable, and so the crews had to spend a lot of time doing all the things you did on a sailing ship to get that extra little bit of speed out of the wind. And they had to do this in an area where the temperature never got below 85 degrees. This is also, to Europeans and British, a disease-infested coast. There's a famous rhyme you may have heard, beware, beware, the bite of Benin, 40 go out and one comes in. Well, this is where the bite of Benin is located. And there are disputes about how many people may have died from disease during this campaign. Bernard Edwards puts the number at 25% of all the men who participated, and that's probably on the high side. Christopher Lloyd has the figures, official figures year by year, and they average out at about 5.6% of deaths by disease. But if a ship was in fact there for 3 years, that does come to close to 20%. And the dangers